everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today, we thought we'd continue the discussion that we started last week talking about game modes. Our intent, really, the first time around, was to talk about the varied game modes that we've played, and we sort of got lost in the forest, so to speak, talking about Milsim. And while Milsim provides airsofters with an opportunity to try a lot of different specific mission objectives and game types and stuff like that, and overall, I would say is probably more varied than your typical weekend skirmish, that isn't the only way for airsofters to experience varied gameplay. And there still is a lot of space for us as players and also as, game organizers as well to make your weekend skirmish interesting, even if it's only, a couple of quick team deathmatch games or capture the flag or whatever. So today we thought we'd dive in a bit more into like our regular weekend skirmishes, and we gave you a bit of an outline of what our, typical skirmish looks like on a weekend, showing up and playing a couple games, but want to dive into some of the more specific game modes that we've played, some of the things that we've tried, and some of the concepts that you're going to want to keep in mind when you're thinking about those, faster game modes that might not have the sort of long tail impact that a Milsim game does. But even if it's a 10-minute game, if one side is like completely smoking the other side, that might not be super fun for everyone. So how do you mix that up, right? So that's what we're going to get into today.
And I mean, I think we can maybe be forgiven a little bit for getting lost in the Milsim stuff last week, because if you're not just tuning in for the first time, it's definitely a bias we've admitted before. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of stuff we've done and seen done in that are, like quick play game modes and game modes for, we're just going to the field to play for a few hours on Saturday or Sunday or whatever, that might be useful to people, right? We've played game modes that have worked really, really well. We've played game modes that have worked really terribly. As we alluded to last week, having guys like in a hostage rescue kind of, quick game trying to carry me is a terrible idea, although really funny.
And we've tried that more than once. Like, it's not like we learned our lesson the first time. I was watching some old footage. I can't remember when it was, but like you were the downed pilot on the Black Hawk field back when it was still like the Black Hawk field as we remember it. And when I say we remember it, I mean the local players would remember it before they turned it into a speedsoft kind of deal. But anyways, yeah, I remember like looking at that footage and having people come up to you and be like, all right, you got to go. And you being like, no, sorry, guys, my legs are broken. You're going to have to carry me. And us going like, are you kidding me? Yeah,
my favorite part of that is, yeah, like you said, we've tried that more than once. That is a thing that has happened a few times. And like, God bless him, I think Karoo did actually at one point pick my sorry ass up and fireman lift me like to and fro.
I think in that video in particular, I'm not sure if it's Cal, but someone definitely does try to pick you up, and I'm pretty sure they get you off the ground and you're like, no, you know what? Just put me down. I'll just walk.
One of the funny things there, I mean, like I don't want to crush anyone's spine. I'm not a small man, like, but it's also it's kind of funny. Like I'm a big dude. I haven't been picked up a whole lot in my life. Like since I was, I don't know. I think I was 6'2" at like 14.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, giving random players at the field a hernia is probably a bad idea. So if you have any plans that suggest that, probably wipe those out.
And like, I think that falls squarely into this space of ideas that seem good on paper that just don't really work out when you try and do them.
Yeah, well, like one of the other things that came up with the like that sort of, oh yeah, we're gonna like grab this guy and rescue him kind of game mode is that it seems really simple. To be like, oh, we'll get like the skinny 14-year-old to be the down pilot or whatever. But that's actually a really bad idea for insurance if you're playing someone with insurance too. Because like if I'm fireman's carrying a 16-year-old kid and I bang his head off of something, like that's no good.
And I think as airsofters, especially younger airsofters, you don't really think about the risk that's associated with whatever you're actually trying to do on the field. And that's fine. I think, we actually had this instance in the Discord with some of the younger players being like, yeah, I'm not scared of being injured. And that's fine. But the reality is, especially if you are getting on in age, and some of the people in our Discord, are in their 40s and 50s, and are, myself, I'm, 37 this year. Like, it's going as you age. I mean, the reality is it becomes harder and harder for you to recover from injuries.
And like, if I break my leg and I can't go to work, like I do have sort of, some insurance for that, but that's going to suck for my ability to like live.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the things that we've often advocated is, this is just a game, right? This is a hobby that we do, and nothing that we're doing on the field should really put us at a greater risk of injury than it necessarily needs to. I think that's one of the reasons that, and I know we're coming off topic a little bit here, but that's one of the reasons why we've advocated against the use of pyro grenades, because we feel that they're, they unnecessarily increase the risk. Same thing with sound grenades. I mean, sound grenades are fine if everyone's wearing hearing protection, but if you have people who aren't, wearing it because they're renters, it's their first time out or whatever, there's a risk that you'll potentially do actual hearing damage to them. And really, there's, this is something we do for fun. And so we shouldn't be worrying about that kind of stuff. There's that level of acceptable risk. And that also plays into whatever the objectives you're going to be asking people to do.
Totally. I mean, like, scar on my nose from getting shot with a, like 470 FPS CO2 Magnum from like 6 feet away. Funny now, not as funny when it happened because I was quite pissed. But like, whatever. Breaking my leg and not being able to teach for 3 months is like, no, I don't think I want to do that.
Yeah, not that happened to you,
no,
but
absolutely.
It did happen to one guy on our team, right? He fractured his leg in like 7 different places. And really, he hasn't played since then because of a combination of just, real life and all this kind of stuff, but also just, it's not necessarily something you really want to go back to when you've suffered such a catastrophic injury in a lot of cases.
I mean, totally. And like, he had to have metal nuts and bolts installed, right? Like, he had non-trivial amounts of complicated stuff happen because of that. And like, he's fine now, which is awesome. Like, I'm really glad he's fine now. But that was a long and arduous process caused by something that really didn't need to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think, this is a roundabout way of coming back to it. But when you're looking at the objectives that you're planning for your game, and whether it's a milsim or not, you really need to think about whether it's realistic and or feasible for them to do that safely, right? And what that looks like is as simple, or can be as simple as, well, does it put them at unnecessary risk because you're asking them to carry someone who's way heavier than their body weight, or climb into a second story of a structure where they're not supposed to go to because it's not stable? Like, all this kind of stuff is things that you want to consider, and you want to, as an organizer, want to think about player safety. But we're getting a little bit sort of off track with this. I think, and that's fine. I think when we're thinking about keeping our games fun, one of the pieces is certainly, well, is it safe for me to do that? But is it realistic, right? Can you actually achieve what you want to do? And I think to give an example, when we played last weekend, the refs were like, all right, well, you Storm Riders, 5 Storm Riders plus 1 random guy are going to go and you're going to attack the village. And your objective is to clear all the defenders out of that village. You have 10 minutes, go.
I haven't heard this story, but I can tell you that didn't work.
Well, it did, actually. We won. And that's not because we're like super baller. It's just because the way that the game was set up. I mean, he gave us 10 minutes and unlimited respawns to go and do whatever we need to do and beat the clock, right? And the reality is that was fine because we felt that, we could be aggressive enough and push enough that we could clear out the defenders and we could do what we needed to do. But on the flip side, if you gave that to a bunch of random players, they might not feel the same way. They might be like, okay, but there's at the time, so it was 6 on 16 or 14, or anyways, it was greater than 2 to 1, right? And if you're, depending on who you're putting on that team, they might not feel that that's necessarily fun. Like, for us, it's a challenge, great.
But we're also crazier than your average airsofter in some ways.
Yeah, and we're up for the challenge, right? We're signing up for it. The ref goes, hey, this is what we want you to do, and we go, okay, sure. And I'll be honest, I didn't know if we would be able to succeed or not. But hey, it's a challenge. Let's give it a go, see what we can do. And we actually managed to do okay. that could have gone either way too, like depending on what they had done and so on and so forth. The point is that, that is one game mode that we had, that we, as a ref, you want to consider, okay, well, is it fun? Are the teams balanced? Do I have the right people doing the right role or playing the right role, to make sure that everybody has fun?
Yeah, maybe don't ask the renters who are there for their first time to try to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Or do something. We've seen this happen a lot. I think when you're thinking about your game modes, is you do like attack and defend, and then one team is successful or not, and then you go, okay, cool, let's switch it up, and we'll do the same thing again, but with different players. And the reality is that doesn't necessarily work, right? Because again, you need to think about, okay, well, who is doing what? Is that what they want to be doing? Is that what they're going to find fun? And is it realistic to have those people doing that, right?
And I guess just, what are the skills and interests of the crew of people I have is a really, I think, a big factor to include, and not necessarily something that we have always thought about correctly when we were trying to design scenarios and figure out like new ways to play. One thing that's probably worth mentioning here is, like we definitely are not the biggest fans, I'll say, of like the TTT or Trouble in Terrorist Town.
Yeah. Which is kind of like Among Us or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, game mode. It's there are so many guys who are baddies and everyone has to wander around and have a chat and wait for the guys who are bad guys to shoot you, kind of thing. And their goal is to get everyone, and your goal is to get the 4 or 5 traders. It's, not an awful game mode, but I think we found generally that a lot of like the younger players really like it. A lot of new players tend to really find it to be a laugh. We've discussed previously that like, we like games that are, encourage us to use our pistols because we think they're really cool, so we want them. But we know that they're not necessarily the most practical piece of kit. And I think that a lot of players see TTT as like a way to get to use them and get to play with those. And, I know I've definitely felt, I think it's probably fair to say even disdainful of the game mode, like just that I didn't like it and that I thought it was kind of stupid.
Yeah, I agree.
And been pretty like inclined to say like, oh, do we really have to do that to the refs? And, honestly, kind of be a bit of a jerk about it. Not out of any sort of sense of entitlement, really, just as like, I don't really find this fun. But lots and lots of players do. Enough players do that, it ends up getting played super regularly.
Yeah, and I mean, for those of you who enjoy it, or if you're not really familiar, like Pat was saying, like the whole idea is like it's kind of like Werewolf or Among Us. So you have the whole group. The refs will blindly select 2 people or 3 people to be the baddies, right? And really, it just evolves into just this like weird situation where everybody's wandering around and not trusting anybody, and randomly shooting each other and trying to figure out who's who, and eventually it winds up into a big old firefight. And that's all fine and dandy, but like Pat was saying, like that's not really our preferred game mode. I mean, it's worth trying out, but after a while, you're like, you know what, we don't want to play this, so you might sit it out or what have you. And again, as a ref or as a game organizer, you want to be conscious of who you have around who's really willing to do that, right? And if they're going to sit out, or if for example, that it's like me and Pat and like 4 other guys, and that me and Pat are going to sit out, then either you need to say, well, don't run that game mode, or say to the players who you're going to sit out, hey, can you please play this because the other guys want to, and, have that sort of open dialogue. And that is true whether you're talking about TTT or any other game mode. Right? If you're talking about like a D-Day assault, for example, and certain players are like, no, I really don't want to do this. Or they're like, I'm fine doing this, but I only want to defend. Well, that's fine. So you work around that and try and keep it fun for everyone.
And for the people who are, in that situation where they're being asked to do something that's, not their favorite kind of playing airsoft, like it's a community sport, the kids who are there, who are like, oh, I really want to try using my pistol or whatever. Or frankly, I'm saying kids, but like, there are people my age who enjoy the game. I shouldn't be assuming that. But like, yeah, they're gonna go, hey, I don't necessarily want to play this game Pat likes as much, but like I'll totally play it because it's fun, whatever, And I think it's sort of a share and share alike mentality is probably really helpful to us in this. We probably benefit as a community from just, being willing to play airsoft. Right. And again, I'm sort of looking back on my past life and going, I'm not sure we did that quite right. So,
Yeah.
Things to adjust going forward. I will note with, some hilarity that I have 2 kills with a sword from playing TTT, and that amuses the hell out of me. Phil is rolling his eyes, and I'm sure you can hear it.
Yeah, you never let us forget that. So, I mean, how can we? So let's get into some of the meat and potatoes that we didn't get into last time. So I think one of the game modes that we play a lot is just attack and defend, right? That is a pretty much a staple of any airsoft field, right? You have one team in one position and their job is to hold that position. And then everybody else, which generally outnumbers the defenders because it's widely accepted that it's easier to hold a position than it is to assault a position.
Especially in airsoft, if the teams don't have LMGs, grenades, cool stuff like that.
Yeah.
It can be quite hard to dig a couple of guys out of a little, box made of wood if they're dedicated to staying there and you don't have some of the tools to open up fire lanes, as we've talked about in previous episodes.
Yeah, and I think some of the challenges too is if you think about like real world solutions to these kinds of problems. I mean, I always remember the time me asking Cal, it's like, hey, Cal, how would you attack this village? And he's like, I wouldn't. I would just call artillery and just shell it. Right? It's like, okay, well, we don't have that luxury in airsoft, nor do we have the luxury of utilizing, a high volume of fire to destroy cover. That doesn't happen. I mean, unless the cover is really crappy in airsoft, that just doesn't happen. So then you are relegated to having to attack it, right? And so in those positions, it's very, very straightforward for a small group of people to hold off a very, very large enemy force if they are, at all competent. And in point of fact, we've done that once at Frontline where we defended the village from, I don't know, I think there was 8 of us at the time. I think there were over 30 attackers. They had unlimited respawns, and I was convinced that we were going to lose. I was like, there's no way we were going to hold this. There's way too many of them. And it turns out that we were very coordinated, and we were just on, and they were very not coordinated, and we were able to win. And so that's not trying to tell you how great we are, but it's just that's the sort of situation that you're facing when you're thinking about an attack and defend, depending on the field that you're playing on. So there's a couple of really important concepts that you want to think about when you're coming up with this sort of game mode. So, number one, when you have an attack and defend, it is always preferable to have many avenues of attack for the attackers, as many as you can manage on your particular field. So on the frontline field, when we do attack and defend, there's not that many avenues of attack. And so whenever possible, we want to do the field as open as possible so that they can come from the north side, they can come from the east side, and they can come from the south side, because we know that the west side is just a no-go. It's a swamp. Nobody goes there. Right? So we want to open it up as much as possible, because by doing that, you give the defenders 2 or 3 things that they need to protect, through 2 or 3 angles they need to protect, I should say, and gives the attackers a much better chance. So that's one thing that you want to consider.
And they end up with a lot of spaces to sort of fire into where you can't get cover from every possible angle. Whereas if you just go, okay, so there's one, like that particular field, there's a road that leads into the sort of village area that's the most used defense objective. Mm-hmm. And if you limit the players attacking to just the road, it is pretty close to impossible to actually successfully punch into and take that objective.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's cover on the road, but not enough to facilitate, a large group of guys moving up. And we lack a lot of the force multipliers, as we were just sort of alluding to, right?
Yeah, totally. And you would need a tremendous amount of coordination, which most teams, even us, are just not capable of producing in a way that is meaningful enough to be able to just storm right in. The other thing when you're thinking about an attack and defend is, generally speaking, you want to try and have the defense have multiple lines of defense, right, to keep it more fun. So basically, you can have an outer line and then an inner line. So if you think about like a building, when we think about the village, for instance, we have one building at the back of the field, and the objective is to defend that particular building, but we can use the entire village. And that's important because it allows defenders to be more flexible. It allows them to sort of fall back to other positions and doesn't relegate them to just using one single building or one single area to defend. Even when we played up at Red Cliff and we would do an attack and defend on the octagon, for instance, we would often say, well, you have to defend the octagon, but you can go anywhere along sort of the quote-unquote battlements where there is concrete. And as long as you can touch concrete, you can go there. And again, this adds to the dynamic of the defense, which makes it more fun. It makes it more interesting because you don't necessarily know exactly where all the defenders are going to be.
And as we were talking about previously, like, it prevents boredom, right? It prevents people from achieving a sort of state where they're like, well, we've probably attacked this every way that we can possibly attack it, right? If you're looking at, just your square structure with, a fixed egress and entry points that is the same size and in the same place every week, because most of us don't have terrain that we can take apart and put back together. There's a finite number of ways to go into that building, and eventually, if you're restricting people to just that building, they're going to exhaust all of them, and you're going to figure out, more or less the optimal way to do it. The octagon's a great example. It is as is implied by the name, an octagonal structure with essentially a window or a door on every facet. And if the players are restricted to being inside of it, I think you can have 8 guys, and Phil and I can probably clear it, just because we've done it so many times.
Yeah.
Like, we could do it with 8 of our teammates who are all coordinating and working really well together, and Phil and I can turn our radios off and we still stand a chance. Simply because we've done it so many times. We know what the best places to go to attack it are. It just hasn't changed. Among other things, there are, easy routes to get into a position where I'm quite capable of hucking all 4 or 5 of the tornado grenades Phil and I have access to in a window. And that will really resolve that problem quite quickly.
Yeah. Another thing that you can also consider when you're thinking about your attack and defend games is it's a lot harder to say, or it's a lot harder to achieve the objective of clearing out all of the defenders from a particular structure. That can potentially be a tall order, excepting if it's one room and you can throw 4 grenades inside the window and off you go, right? But most of the time, if you have like an area that you need to clear out all of the defenders on, that's going to be a bit of a challenge because, you have some people who are quite capable of digging into a position and making certain that they can't be seen. And, then anytime anybody comes close, they get ambushed and stuff. So one of the ways that you can level the playing field with the defenders and the attackers is to give the attackers a particular objective that they need to capture within that sphere that the defenders are responsible for. So to give you an example, in the village field that we use, there are lots of structures, and there are 2-story structures, and there's, a church and a bank and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they're just square buildings, but, they're dressed up to look, right,
nice
like
Wild
the part.
West labels, right? It's definitely done with a specific goal in mind.
Yeah. So you can know that one particular structure is more defensible than the others. So you give the attackers a prop, like a bomb or an ammo crate or whatever you want to call it, and their objective is to get that particular prop to another structure that is less defensible. Right? So the defenders can certainly take that defensive structure that is really, really good, but that's not what they have to protect. They have to protect some other place. Right? So the objective is get that package to that location, and now your defenders have to purposefully weaken their usually very strong defense because, of course, you've played this multiple times and you know exactly how it goes. But they can't do that this time because if they do, they're going to lose because they need to protect this other place, right?
And to be a kind of game design nerd for a second here, if you're trying to create scenarios, you want scenarios where both the attacker and the defender, or both teams if it's sort of an even start kind of thing, have suboptimal choices they can make, where they have mistakes that are available to them. Because people making mistakes and also making correct decisions during gameplay is what makes gameplay rewarding, right? Obviously we enjoy the personal skills aspect, the shooting and taking cover and all that jazz. But from a team point of view, or a group of people attempting to be a team and working to accomplish an objective, you often are in that sort of we got 4 guys, that's close enough to being a fire team to work. Now how do we actually accomplish this? And the more wrenches you throw in as the referee or the person planning the game or whatever, the more it becomes challenging, although within reason, right? You don't want to put in too many, and one of the things that we have done that I think worked really well, we don't do it at Frontline because they have referees, but I don't know, maybe one of them is listening and they'll think it's a cool idea, is we at some point sat down Phil and I did up a deck of playing cards that was just deal a couple of objectives, with the intent that we'd be able to just be like, okay, we're going to skip some of the chatting and skip some of the figuring out, and we'll just go, all right, top 3 cards are, hostage, this building, this time limit, rad. That worked pretty well. We went through like tons and tons of effort, being, old school RPG nerds, to like make sure there were 52 cards, and it was a terrible idea.
Yeah, we never really used it a whole lot.
Mostly because we only needed like 10.
Yeah.
Right? So don't go overboard on it. But the basic idea was really sound, right? Just, okay, quick scenario generation, because it keeps everyone playing and keeps them thinking on their feet, right? But the more you test anything like that, the more likely you are to find things in it that don't necessarily work, right? So if we had developed one for Frontline, we might have had defend the jailhouse, which is in the middle of the village. The jailhouse has no walls.
Yeah.
It is the most indefensible structure I can think of on that entire field. So be conscious when you're trying to put together game modes of what can and can't work like that. And think in terms of both, what would Dumb Pat do? Because Dumb Pat will definitely arrive and play. And also think in terms of, what clever things could people do to get around this that are positive, right? So like we were saying, if we're doing an attack defend, you want to have as many avenues of attack as possible for the defenders, and maybe have a situation where the defenders can have multiple lines of defense, because that makes it more interesting and grants both sets of players more choices, more options. But you don't necessarily want to go, okay, well, we're going to have medics, right? We've used medics in a bunch of Milsim games. It's great. We've tried to use them in casual games, and a lot of the time it just results in people going, oh, that medic's cheating, right? It just causes people to go, oh, I shot him and now he's back shooting at me and I don't know where their medic is, so I guess he just got back up.
Yeah.
And that is more of a feels bad than a positive.
Yeah, you need to make sure if you're going to be using medics in like a small game with little. So we've used medics in the past using the water bottle method that we talked about, like for milsims, like we've used armbands and stuff. If you're going to use like a tap medic system, then you want to make sure that the refs are sort of on point to make sure that people are confident that the cheating is not happening. It sucks that you have to think about it, but again, you have to be realistic as well. It also, the people who you're playing with, and sometimes you may have no concerns because you know the whole crew and everyone's good to go. And sometimes you're like, we don't really know, there's some renters or whatever. We want to make sure everyone has a good time, so we'll just keep a handle on it. The other thing that I think is worthwhile, we talked about the attack and defend, and this next concept really certainly can apply to attack defend, is also don't be afraid to turn your scenario sort of upside down, right? So if you think about attack and defend, you have a team that is defending a particular place and the other team is trying to get in. But what if you had a team that starts off in a defensible position and their job is to get out? Right? Yep. And we've done this before where one team actually has to cross the entire field. So they start in one place and they actually have to move from one place to the other. And as the defenders or the other team is being killed, they go and they respawn in different places. And that the objective of the team is to push down. That can certainly work too. And really what you're just doing is you're doing like a rush game or what have you, but you're just turning it inside out. Right? Or upside down, I should say. And there's nothing wrong with that. Any type of game mode that you're playing, try and do it in a slightly different way. We did this with even a team deathmatch that we had the other weekend when we were playing. Normally, when we play a team deathmatch on the road and wood field at Frontline, for example, we normally play, and the way that the cover is orientated is for north to south engagement.
Yep.
So instead of doing north to south, we had one team start on the west, we had one team start on the east, and we did a west to east engagement. And that was completely new for everybody. None of us had ever done that before. And it completely changes the field because, so in this particular case, the people attacking from the west, they're fighting uphill, not downhill. And if you've watched Star Wars Episode 3, you know that whoever has the high ground wins. But you also have the situation where the covers that normally you would use, if you have like a pallet, it's no longer a piece of effective cover for you because north to south, that's fine. You have like 3 feet of pallet. But east to west, you have 6 inches of pallet, and it's not going to go.
Yeah.
Right?
Things have become much more complicated unless you suddenly have gotten smaller.
Yeah. And so you end up having to be really a lot more thoughtful about where you go. The field is essentially a new field, right? So anyways, the point of all this is to say, don't hesitate to change stuff around and try it, right? And in some cases, you'll find that actually you can't particularly game a field in that direction because it's too hard to go, it's too much of a slog, or really like one side has much, much, much better cover just by virtue of the fact that how it was built and it was never intended to be used that way. And then the other side has like no cover, right? So then you realize, maybe we can, maybe we can't. But when you're designing these game modes, if you find that it's gotten a little bit stale, just change the orientation.
And I mean, one of the things that I was going to say in a similar vein is you can switch. If you're used to fighting corner to corner, switch corners.
Yeah, exactly,
right?
For sure.
Or, have everyone start inside of a building, right? Or one team start inside of a building, although that gets hard.
Yeah, and, to be clear, like these game modes that we're trying, even with objectives and stuff, they're not necessarily long game modes. You can have, when we attack the village, as I was saying at the start, that was a 10-minute objective, right? 10 minutes, that's it. That's what you got to do. When you play D-Day, it's like 15 minutes. You got to cross the entire field, and you have 15 minutes to get to the bunkers. Otherwise you lose. And you can do like a 30-minute rush game, right? And every time you take an objective, you add back, let's say, 5 minutes on the clock. So really, the most you're ever going to get is a 40-minute rush game, right? Totally reasonable. It's not, it's not eating up most of your day. Like you still have lots of time to do all kinds of other game modes, but you also have the flexibility to try something that has a bit more of a longer tail to it. It's a bit more strategic. You have a little bit more planning that goes into it, and you have to just think critically rather than just run around the field pulling the trigger. And
if you're doing sort of that rush game mode, right? You can try shortening the length, and sometimes it will mean the game is not as fun. There's definitely a point at which it's like, nope, this is too short. We can't actually do it. But so where we most typically play that sort of rush, leapfrogging objective to objective to objective game mode, the hardest part is getting started. Just the nature of the field we start on is you're fighting into very dense cover from very sparse cover. It is the hardest part of the game by far to get out and get to the first goalpost. And so we've found that chopping off time added does sort of work okay, right? So if you give us 10 minutes back every time we take an objective, we'll have a lot of time by the time we get to the last objective. But if you give us back 3, it's still potentially doable. We just have a lot less time because the biggest portion of the starting clock is used to get out of there. Depending on the layout of your field, that may or may not be the case. So you can tweak that on the fly. If you're playing, even sort of like a just team deathmatch game, you can still actually change the game mode a surprising amount with a timer. One of the ones that we sort of started using inadvertently up at Redcliffe was just, it's a large wooded area. So there'd be times where you'd have like 2 or 3 guys left out of 12 who were, on the sneakier side and wander around in the woods and not really getting engaged. And it's like, well, you guys have 3 minutes or the other 10 players are just going to decide you are the enemy team and come get you.
Yeah, I remember doing that many times. Another thing about game design that I think is worth considering too, and we see this a lot, it's this notion of unlimited lives, right? And I'm not, for or against it. However, I think the reason that I'm bringing this up is because I want you guys to consider, what does it actually mean when you give people unlimited lives? When you're given unlimited lives, the reality is most players are not running back and forth to their respawn over and over and over and over again. There certainly have been games where I've played with unlimited lives and I've respawned like 5 or 6 times. But I haven't respawned 10 or 15 or 20 in 15-minute, 20-minute time frame. Because A, I'm not getting hit that often, if I'm, lucky. But B, I just don't have the energy.
Yeah.
right? I'll run to the respawn and run back the first time. I might do it the second time. I may or may not do it the third time, and I'm not doing it the fourth time, right? And so consequently, what you end up with is, yeah, you have unlimited lives, but you're not really going to respawn much more than 3, 4, maybe 5 times on the outside. But what you are doing is giving people a completely different mindset when they hit the field, right? Because you have unlimited lives. Well, guess what you're going to do? You're going to be a lot more liberal with your application because you're not afraid to get hit because you're just going to get right back in.
If you give Pat unlimited lives, Pat will spend at least one of them with his gun firing from the hip on full auto, shouting because it's hilarious.
Yeah, but the reality is that you're going to take a lot more risks. You're going to do a lot more risky maneuvers on the field. You're going to try stuff that you wouldn't normally try because you don't have to worry about getting hit. Like, yeah, you get hit, you could go to respawn, come back. The reality, though, is that in a lot of cases, that's going to pay off for you.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
You're going to try something gutsy. It's going to work out, and then you're going to be in a much better position, and then you can keep on keeping on. That's exactly what happened to us when we played that Unlimited Respawns Village Attack the other day. I was up in the sniper tower. I was laying down hate on like 4 different players. I was shooting a lot of BBs. And at some point, Chris just rushed this 2-story structure after I hit the guy that was down there, and he just moved there and parked his butt there. Well, we likely would not have been that aggressive if we had, only one respawn.
Yeah, caring about getting shot changes the way you play a great deal.
But Chris didn't go back to the respawn like 10 times that game. Like, he probably got hit like 4, maybe 5 times. But really, we were just pushing hard and, applying good fundamentals, but also being much more aggressive, and it was paying out. So the point of me bringing this up is when you make the decision to give unlimited lives to a particular player, or a particular team, I should say, you are changing the way that realistically they're going to play on the field. You're going to turn them into a much more aggressive fighting force. And that in of itself is better than telling them, hey, you have 5 respawns. Firstly, it's easier to manage because nobody has to count, right? You just go back and come back and that's fine. But
and no one
because
gets confused.
in their mind, unlimited is more than 5, they're just going to push.
Absolutely.
So when you're thinking about your game design, that's something you really want to consider.
For sure. And I think that, by the same token, giving people, more or less lives to accomplish something changes the way they play. I think most players are probably, if you give them 3 lives, are a lot more aggressive on their first one than they are on their last.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no question. If you're on your last life, you're always going to be a bit more cautious because you don't want to get hit, right?
Well, we all want to keep playing, right? That's we're here to play airsoft rather than to watch. So yeah, that works out positively. Likewise, if you have an attacking team with a bunch of players who are prone to being really cautious, right? You can give them an extra life or 2, and it will encourage them, motivate them to go, yeah, try stuff, right? Which can especially be good for new players who are often a little more shy about getting shot at, a little more concerned about, being careful in their play because they're like, oh, this stings, I don't know. Or just because they're new and they're intimidated by it all. Mm-hmm. And the best way to build skill and to learn is to try stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Every time I get shot in the face, I still usually learn something new. Or I am reminded of something old, such as don't stick your head out without your gun behind it.
Yep, no question. The last thing I really want to talk about, I think, is we mentioned, a TTT or a werewolf or Among Us or whatever we want to call it, in terms of silly game modes. There's also one game mode that we've talked about sort of in the past, but I think is worth noting as a bit of a silly game mode, especially if you're listening to this podcast and your community is a little bit like ours, which is to say it's a bit smaller. Especially if, you have a game where you have like 10 people showing up. Right? Which for some people might seem like a big day. And I know we've talked about this before, but when we started playing, 10 people was a big day. Now, 10 people is an okay day. But, like we tend to, like last weekend, we had over 20 players and that was good. So 10 seems a little bit lower. But regardless, if you had got like 10 players, you got 8 players, one game mode that we used to play a lot back in the day, we just called James Bond. And this was a very silly, fun type of game mode. And what it is basically you have one player who plays the role of James Bond, the super spy. And This player will be given either a semi-locked rifle or a handgun. And for the purpose of this game, this airsoft gun is considered silenced. And I don't mean like, I know that when you're like, it's not a silencer, Phil, it's a suppressor. No, I mean like movie silent. Like John Wick walking down a corridor, shooting at people, and nobody even hears the gun, which is not at all what happens in real life. But for the purposes of this, it's like, it's dead silent. And everybody else, other than James Bond in this game type, is a dumb guard, right? So James Bond's goal is to kill all of the dumb guards. And the dumb guards cannot aim their rifles. They can only shoot them from the hip. And they can only really shoot them when they can see James Bond and doing his thing. Other than that, if they hear a noise, they have to be like, did I hear something? And sort of plot over and try and see what they heard. And if James Bond is silent and doesn't make a sound and just sits still, even if the players see them, they have to go like, guess it was nothing, turn around and leave.
And there is some fun in playing a dumb guard. Like, it genuinely is pretty funny.
Yeah. And so it's not until the guards themselves start shooting at James Bond, again, from the hip, because no aiming allowed, that the other guards can hear the airsoft guns going off and then be like, oh my God, there must be trouble, and sort of saunter over and help. But again, as soon as James Bond disappears, they're like, I don't know where he went. Right? Because again, it's the dumb guards. And the whole purpose of this is for James Bond to very silently eliminate all the other players. When they're hit, they just fall over and they just pretend to be dead. And a guard might eventually find them and say, oh my God, who did this? And look around and not see anything and go, guess it was nothing. And then move on. Just like you'd see like in video games and all this kind of stuff. And this might seem like really like stupid and silly. And if you feel that this is stupid and silly, then I mean, fair enough. But it is hilarious. It's fun to play as a dumb guard. It's fun to play as James Bond because you feel like this is just absolutely ridiculous. But I can guarantee you that if you play that game mode on your field with your 10 players or whomever, everybody is going to have a laugh. Everybody's going to have a great time. Everyone is going to want to play James Bond because it's different. And you might not get to go through everybody, and that's fine. Just next time you get to play with different players, but it absolutely is a hilarious way to sort of clue up a day. Or if you have had, a couple of particularly intense games where players are tired or maybe they're grumpy because they just got shot in the nose a whole bunch or what have you. And I'm not saying that for Pat, but I got shot in the nose last game and I was pretty grumpy about it. And, I went inside and cried so nobody saw me and all this kind of stuff. But the point is, like, if you've had a couple of games like that, it can be really a good thing to break the tension. And the best way you can do that is with laughter.
And it gives people a chance to sort of take a breather, because James Bond has to move kind of slowly because he's moving quietly and being sneaky, and the guards have to move slowly because they're being, cabbages. And it's just, it is good, wholesome, silly fun, which is really, in a lot of ways, like what we're here for anyway. And I think it helps to remind us all that, like, we shouldn't take this too seriously. Because, we are... I feel sort of in the middle between the like really intensely milsim player and the sort of like more chill airsofter, but we definitely are on the play to win milsim side of things. And I think even for our team, or maybe especially for our team, and some days it helps us to not be too much up in our heads and just remember, oh yeah, we're literally playing with toy guns and being goofy.
Yeah.
Right. Because, as much time as we put into this and as much effort and energy and money as we all put into this, it's a game. It should be fun, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Like, it's easy for us to fall into this trap. We've got all this crazy operator gear. Like, you're looking like SEAL Team 6 because you got your 360-degree nods or whatever. And all that is fine and dandy. But if you forget to have fun, then sort of... what's the point? And I'm not saying that that's not fun to kit yourself out. I've just got some new kit that I'm excited to try out, but that doesn't mean that you can't have fun with it, right? It doesn't mean you shouldn't be silly and goofy and do both the things that are fun as well as the games that are more serious that allows you to test your mettle, so to speak, right?
Absolutely.
So hopefully we've given you some things to consider when you're thinking about your weekend skirmishes, your shorter objective games, and all this kind of stuff. Like we said, it's not all about milsim. You can do a lot in, a half an hour game and a 45-minute game. And the most important thing is for you to think about how you can have fun, making objectives fun for people, and also having game modes that are just pure fun themselves. So you can have a laugh, break the tension, and do what we're all here to do, which is have a good time, right? The key thing to remember is if stuff is getting stale, don't be afraid to switch it around. Turn it inside out. Start from different corners. Push in ways that you don't normally push. Go, left to right instead of right to left. All this kind of stuff will make it so that your games keep being varied, but also utilizing the same space and the same fields that you're always going to be playing at, right? It just keeps things interesting, and a challenge for everybody, even the players who've done this hundreds and hundreds of times.
So yeah, I think the moral of this is, go take as many different ways of playing games as you can think of to try. And if you guys have game modes we haven't talked about, suggest them. If you have ways of thinking about game modes we have talked about that we didn't think of, man, we'd love to hear about it. Pop onto the Discord, leave us a comment, anything like that. We are absolutely happy to try new game modes, whether they're serious or goofy. Either way, I hope you guys have a great week, and we will talk to you next week.
Take care, everyone. Talk to you next week.